All right, so we might kick off properly. Welcome everyone. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia, or NENA. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to our webinar today. We've been following the wonderful work of Regen Melbourne and their explorations of the Doughnut Economy framework. And so I was really delighted when Kai and Sean were able to join us today and really take the reins and lead us through both what the Doughnut Economy framework is and what they've been up to in Melbourne and what they've been discovering. So before I hand over to our lovely speakers today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on the Turrbal and Yagara lands, the traditional lands of the peoples who have lived in this place since time immemorial. I'm in North Brisbane, which is particularly associated with the Turrbal language group. And I would like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge the work that NENA does to support the decolonisation of minds, hearts, spirits and activities in this wonderful continent. And it always fills me with great happiness to see everyone saying hello in the chat box, both from their Western name town and also their traditional lands and the names of the languages that have been here for such a long time. So welcome to everybody. I'm going to let Kai and Sean introduce themselves today because I know they wear a number of different hats and they may want to just focus on particular aspects of their work. People will be continuing to join us and I'll keep popping some notes in the chat. But for now, I'd love to hand you over to Kai to share with you what's been going on with Regen Melbourne. Kai.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Wonderful to be here. It's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces as well. So it's wonderful. Thank you so much for having us, Michelle. It's as we'll talk about in a moment, this is the last of our roundtable sessions for the process that we're on at the moment. So it's absolutely perfect that is with NENA. It feels spot on. So thank you so much for having us. So my name is Kai Lofgren. My sort of day job is as the head of strategy at an organisation called Small Giants Academy. And we're a non-profit media and education initiative really looking at exploring the idea of empathy in leadership and how we can use that to transition to a more just and sustainable economy. I'll put a link in the chat later to the organisation, but you can take a look there. But I guess I'm really thrilled to be able to host today's session. And I'm also joined by Sean, who's at Circular Economy Victoria, and Stephen, who is at Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, who are part of our core collective organising this Regen Melbourne work. That collective also includes Willow, who's part of an organisation called the Coalition of Everyone, and then Alison, who's with the City of Melbourne, both of whom may join us a little bit later. I'm going to sort of frame today's session, but I'd also love to just acknowledge that we're not going to go around in the circle and meet everybody today. We don't have the time to do that. And Michelle's asked you to put, where you are in Australia and acknowledge country. But I'm also curious as to the roles that you have in your life that relate to this conversation. So if you want to just do a quick, 1-2 sentence intro in the chat, we'd love to have some record of that, of who is here and where you're coming from and the organisation you're part of. So maybe do that if you have the chance, open the chat box and tap away. I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm calling in from Melbourne and many of us are calling in from, I think, all over Australia. But I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of what we now call Melbourne, the Bunurong, Bunwurrung and the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Pay our respects to elders past and present and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present today. We have also made it our practice to acknowledge Prabinata, which is the Bunwurrung word for Mother Earth, and the ongoing connection of traditional custodians to the land and the waterways of Melbourne. And always acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded here. This always was and will be Aboriginal land. So in today's forum, what I'm going to do is shortly hand over to Sean, who's the CEO of Circular Economy Victoria. And he's going to present the Doughnut model kind of in a broad sense, give us an all kind of a 101, just so we're all on the same page. And we can have a little bit of a high level conversation about this. We'd love to hear any questions you have, any challenges you feel around the model, things that work for you, things that don't work for you. So we'll facilitate a little bit of a conversation about the model itself. And then once we've done that, I'll present some of the ways that we've been starting to localise the model to Melbourne. So as many of you will be aware, there's a city portrait methodology which has come out of places like Amsterdam and Philadelphia and Portland that we've adapted for the Melbourne context. So I'll talk a little bit about that and ask for your reflections and insights on some of the themes. So does that sound okay as a bit of a structure? We're all with me? Excellent. Some nods of the heads, just getting going on a Friday. It's been a long week, perhaps. We'll get going. Sean, I'm going to pass to you. As you do a bit of an introduction, I'm going to bring up your just a quick slide so people can follow, and I'll hand over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kai. Thanks, Michelle. My name's Sean Trick. It's really great to be with you today. And as Kai mentioned, I'm CEO of Circular Economy Victoria, which is a small incorporated not-for-profit. And we look to make systemic change towards a circular economy. And the way that we play with the donut is we've really embedded Kate's work as our sort of vision and a compass. So our vision as an organization is to create a safe and just space for humanity to thrive in balance with the planet. And we use circular principles to help us get there. All right, so the donut. I'm very excited to talk about this. I've been deeply in report writing mode for the last few days. So getting back to presentation, this is the donut. It's two concentric circles. It comes from a book called Doughnut Economics, which was written by Kate Raworth. And in this book, she put 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist. The first one being the donut. So as I mentioned, 2 concentric circles. The inner circle is the social foundation, and this is comprised of 12 elements in which we need in order to live a safe and just life. And this is like food, water, health, etc. And these are closely aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. They were developed in roughly the same time, and both were referenced in each other's work. The Ecological Ceiling is made up of 9 planetary boundary elements put forward by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And this is by large scientific consensus, the boundaries for our provisioning systems that we need to remain within in order not to overstress those systems and degrade them to a point that they cannot be recovered. So the idea of this vision in the book is talked about, we need a more holistic vision as opposed to GDP. So it goes like this. We need to meet the needs of all within the social foundation, so reduce that shortfall, get across the social foundation into the safe and just space for humanity, but do so in a way that doesn't exceed the ecological ceiling. And what's really powerful about this model is that in one image, you can basically convey a lot of very complex ideas, both on the social side as well as on the ecological side. But as mentioned, this is one of the 7 ways that Kate put forward in her book, How to Think Like a 21st Century Economist. And just a disclaimer, I'm not an economist, I'm an engineer, and I'm an expert by playing with this model. So an expert through actual, using this model in various situations, both in industry and local government and in the commons. So yeah, I speak to you from that perspective. So Kai, if we can go to that next slide. So I've put the 7 ways to think like a 21st century economist into a framework to help us convey these complex thoughts in a very short time frame. So roughly speaking, we need to use a donut to find our why and to maintain our course. We can use this on a macroeconomic way to help guide policy and help guide things like finalizing the Sustainable Development Goals. Kate talks in her book that when they were finalizing the actual SDGs, they had an image of the donut to just help make sure that the way that they're formulating it is systemic and that they are covering everything. But you can also use it in a micro sense. We've worked with local governments and organizations to use it as a problem-solving compass. So, you've got these 21 elements. If you're solving something for food, what are the externalities that need to be part of this problem-solving skill? How can you use it as a sort of systems thinking compass to make sure that you are addressing problems without starting bigger ones, but also that you're compounding impact, where you might find that there's an education program working in your organization that can be a part of this, or this food program can support it. Then a key paradigm shift that we need to all kind of get around is this idea of becoming growth agnostic. And that's to say that growth isn't good or bad. It's needed in some circumstances and not in others. Some systems need to grow, others don't. And it's this almost comfort or being comfortable with being growth agnostic that we all need to get our heads around. And it's a very pointy topic in economics and in this journey towards sustainability. So I'll just leave that at there. Then going into the 21st century economy, we need to become proficient in systems thinking and design thinking. The world is an inherently dynamic, complex place, and it can't be, especially the economy, can't be mapped out by mathematical equations as hard as we try. So we need to build ways to deal with this complexity and be comfortable in this complexity. And also the design thinking. In economics, they talk about rational economic man, and Kate says that this individual doesn't exist. So we're all socially adaptable humans. So it's about taking human-centric, points of view when you're solving problems, and use that design thinking to create more socially adaptable solutions. Then, broadly speaking, we need to aim towards 3 key metrics, and metrics are I'm using in a very broad sense here. Idea we need to create the economy and whatever micro problem that we're solving in our spheres of influence needs to be regenerative by design. So instead of in economics waiting for things to clear, waiting for the economy to grow big enough in order for it to clean itself up, we need to really design it to be regenerative. As same with distributive, instead of waiting for the economy to grow big enough or the system to grow big enough that everyone can get a slice of the pie, how can we design distribution right at the beginning? And then representation, which was put forward by in the book through the embedded economy diagram, which in itself is an extremely powerful diagram. And it speaks that the economy isn't just comprised of the market, it's comprised of 4 key sections. The market is one of them, the state is another, the commons and the household. And these 4 sections of the economy are empowered by financial flows, but most importantly that they all equally important, and without one of them, the other cannot really fulfill the need of our economy. And this economy is then embedded within society, which is embedded within the environment, and you have energy and material flows flowing throughout the system. So in a very short nutshell, from someone who plays with this model quite regularly, that's Doughnut Economics. I highly recommend the book. Kate narrates the audiobook herself, so it's a great listen if you're keen for that. And yeah, hope this provided some insights. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean. It is like a big piece of work summarized very briefly. So for some people, that'll be a kind of a reminder. Other people who are a little bit newer to this, it might feel a little bit like that was a bit too fast, but I hope it provided some kind of early reflections of the model itself. And I just echo what Sean was saying, that the way that we often think about the donut is through this, the visual, which is incredibly powerful in its own right, but it is only one of the 7 ways that she describes in the book. So highly recommend getting into that in a more detailed way. I'm going to turn that off. And I've also just been reading some of your little reflections in the chat and introducing yourselves. And I just want to really hear from you all. So I'm going to pause our kind of introduction, and I'm just curious to hear from anybody who's wanting to share, or maybe just ask a question in the chat about the donut model itself. What is it in this that made you want to come today? What are you challenged by in this model? Like, what do you feel like doesn't work? And where do you think it fits in the ecosystem or the broader ecosystem of all of our work that we're working on? I'd just love to hear any questions and have a little discussion about the model before I talk about, what we've done with it here in Melbourne. Does anyone want to jump off mute and ask a question?
To get things started,
Yes.
has asked a really excellent question that we get a lot. How does Doughnut Economics mesh with steady state economy ideas? Some of these older ideas that emerged in the 70s and continue to come out today with Daley, Jackson and others.
Yeah, I can do a very quick comment or reflection on that, and then maybe I'll pass back to you, Michelle. I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I guess I feel like Kate's model very proudly builds on, the traditions that I think many of us have been sort of immersed in for literally decades. And she sort of sees this as the culmination of a lot of that work. And so there's no shying away from the fact that this is not a new idea. It's a kind of a new visualization and a new invitation into this conversation. So that's, I guess, my first reflection. My second one is that she's designed the kind of macro donut to be accessible at in a very wide way. So she's based it on existing, as Sean said, existing kind of scientific consensus around the boundaries, and existing kind of global consensus around the social foundation, around the SDGs. Now that both has huge advantages, because it means that she's not trying to convince people of a new set of metrics or a new set of parameters. And of course, it also has drawbacks, because those agreements have drawbacks because they require consensus. And so that's why the adaptation of the model at both the city scale or at an organizational scale, or adapting it to context is so critical. And I think, to Kate's credit, she's been incredibly open to that process. In fact, she's encouraged it using the tools that are coming out of the Doughnut Economics Action Lab in Europe. So actively encouraging that playfulness and tweaking and adapting the model, I think it gives it a much better kind of practical impact or tangible impact in the world. So I guess that's my reflection, Michelle. Did you have thoughts on it?
Yeah, look, I agree with what you say. And I think she should be commended not only for the rigor of her intellectual work, but just the fantastic communication tool that the Doughnut is. As someone who's probably a bit older than some of you on this call, the one thing I'd comment is that the remarkable work that Herman Daly and many others have done inside steady state economics really forged the way forward for people to be thinking about the disconnect between economic thinking and this pretend world of rational human beings. But also they always pointed out that neoclassical economics was like an organ of the human body outside of the human body. It was seen as something that had no beginning and no end. Its outputs, its impact was seen as externalities. So steady state economics and ecological economics really have identified many of the problems with neoclassical economics, have tried to find solutions. But what was interesting is that the planetary boundaries concept itself, with our own Australian wonderful human being, Will Steffen, played a part in creating with the Stockholm Resilience Institute. Planetary boundaries really gave people like Kate Raworth the outer limits. So steady state and ecological economics were always talking about ensuring that economic systems supported human beings and were within the realm of ecological limits. But it was actually very hard to articulate that for your average audience prior to planetary boundaries. So I think there are some other finer details that people critique. Being growth agnostic is sometimes something that people aren't comfortable with, when many people have spent decades trying to challenge the pro-material growth destruction of the current economic paradigm. But I won't go into that discussion today. And the other big issue that I think some folks have said Kate Raworth has skipped over and completely avoided is overpopulation. So that might just be a strategy to get people engaging with these conversations in a way they haven't done before. But when the rubber hits the road, when the solar panel hits the local community, we really need to be focusing on the unique stuff around place and what's going on with consumption, production, population. So that's my 2 cents worth. But I love the fact that people are now excited about talking about economic theory and economic frameworks. So I'm a huge fan of the Doughnut.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. We had a roundtable a few weeks ago with a bunch of economists. We actually brought together explicitly both mainstream and, I guess, more renegade economists here in Melbourne. And there was a fascinating debate around that question of, is the current economic system compatible with the Doughnut or not? And some people were huge advocates for the Doughnut, but also saw the current paradigm as a way of achieving the Doughnut, whereas other people were saying it's completely incompatible. And I think that it's just an example of that, invitation into the conversation. And then through the localization of the model, we can get a bit more granular and specific about, which levers need to fundamentally change. Wayne, I'm wanting to open up the microphone to you too, if you had any reflections in response, but I'm also happy to leave that to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Kate. I just wanted to get people's feelings, and thank you, Michelle, for bringing up that question about, because I think very much like Michelle that the boundaries, the planetary boundaries, have been established by ecological economists and also by the work of Daly and others there. And I think Kate is attempting to try and fit. I mean, she's a great supporter of Daly, so I think that she's trying to put that in there. What I'm thinking about now is more of the work of Jason Hickel and degrowth, and wondering what people's understanding is of degrowth and how they see that fitting in to the work of Kate and others. So that's really a pressing issue for me, and one that I'm talking with my colleagues from Economic Reform Australia and CASI, the Centre for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy, New South Wales. So we're having ongoing discussions about this and the impacts of it. So I'd just like to put that out there into the mix for us to discuss today. We'll have a think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I haven't read Hickel's latest book, but it's on my list. And but I might throw it, Sean, maybe just briefly to you on that question of the growth agnostic framing that Kate puts forward. And then maybe, I know, Stephen, I know you've read Hickel's work, so you might want to comment as well.
Yeah, it's a pointed topic, and I'm definitely not fully equipped to answer that. I think in my journey, both as an engineer, where you're optimizing companies to grow, to extract as much productivity out of the resources that are flowing through its supply chains as possible, without any note of what that natural system, how it's degrading it, but also at the end of life, how it's being returned back into that system, and how the natural sinks are being overloaded. So when I think about growth agnosticism, what Kate puts forward, I think I'm from South Africa, and our economy is very unequal, and it does need to grow a bit in order for the people to really become uplifted and to get into the donut. So on one hand, personally, I think that I like the idea that growth isn't bad at all costs. If we go into that paradigm that we need to degrow, because I come from a place that the economy does need to grow. But then here in Australia, working here, I see it in a totally opposite way. I'm like, here we actually need to talk about degrowth very seriously. It's like the number of plants we're using on a yearly basis in terms of our own economy is just ridiculous. So here we need to have serious conversations about degrowth as part of the donut. So that, I suppose, that's just my personal take on it. So that's why I like the term, agnostic.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And I just noticed that Kieran, who's been part of our process in Regen Melbourne as well, has just posted a link to a blog that is on this specific question, so people can check that out as well. Before we move on, Stephen, I know you've been raving about the book and interested in that theme. So do you want to just chip in?
Yeah, Kai. Look, I'm not an economist. I always start with that. That I've come from this from a social justice perspective, and looking for the causes of some of the issues that my work is concerned with, particularly education, employment, inequity, and the causes of the causes being the design of our economic system. So I'll just put that out there to begin with. I've been on a learning journey, and that learning journey really kind of, the way I see it is that it's a spectrum of understanding, and where Doughnut Economics fits in with degrowth along that spectrum of understanding, it to me is that the way that Jason talks about the relationship primarily, I think, is more about the relationship between the global north and the global south. And that's where he comes from in terms of degrowth, is that we cannot continue in the global north on our trajectory and can continue to exploit the global south for our own economic gain and our own prosperity. And that's the confrontation we need to have, and that's the conversation we need to have. And I think he is much further along on that spectrum of understanding in terms of our ecological footprint in the global north than when you come at the Doughnut Economics framework and that understanding. Does that make sense? Is that I think they're compatible, but I think that Jason takes it a step further and really talks about that vast inequality and the way our economic system is absolutely underpinned by the exploitation of the global south. and we need to think about how we degrow our exploitation of the global south in our economic future.
Thanks, Stephen. I feel like we need a campfire and a bottle of wine, and we could really make some progress. Friday lunchtime on Zoom doesn't do it justice. I might also add that I think that narrative around like there's not a simple word that can define this. So even the idea of degrowth, I think, just doesn't hold the wholeness of the conversation. And even in the context of a city like Melbourne, which we'll talk about in a minute, there are sectors in our economy that absolutely need to grow and be thriving for Melbourne's future. And then clearly there are sectors and areas that need to not. So there's even within our city scale, it's complex. So I'd love if there's any other, one or two other questions that we have before I take us through what we've done in Melbourne. I'd just love to hear it. Any other challenges or suggestions or thoughts?
Kev, am I unmuted? It's Wayne again.
Oh yes, hey.
Yeah, look, I'd like to put forward the idea that maybe we need to be thinking from a macro monetary reality. That is the work of Phil Lorne, who also supports the work of Daly. And we're looking at it, using the lens from modern monetary theory, understanding, how money operates in the economy and what we can do in terms of, creating prosperity, but making sure that we don't, that we don't go to extremes in terms of the use of resources. We stay within the planetary boundaries. So I think that I'm also, a believer that modern monetary theory has that lens for us to be able to see how far we can go. And I know that Phil and Bill Mitchell, who is one of the developers of modern monetary theory with the Americans over in the United States, are working on something now. And I believe also Noel Pearson has come in as well. They're working on a project to try and come up with what we might call here in Australia, a green transition. So I'm thinking that I can see that from your point of view, you've made an incredible progress there in Melbourne. You're probably ahead of us. And South Australia and Melbourne seem to be ahead of New South Wales in some aspects. We seem to be lagging behind.
I'll try not to take pride in that, Wayne.
Well, we give credit where credit is due, but I think.
I guess my reflection, Wayne, is around there seems to be a new a breed of particularly female economists prominently around the world. Mariana Mazzucato, Kate, obviously, Stephanie Kelton on MMT.
I'm a big fan of the three of them. In fact, I went to Mariana's talk when she came here to Australia. She talked at Redfern. John Menadue brought her out for the Centre for Economic.
Yeah, she's amazing, and I would add to that mix the work of Carlota Perez as an economic historian. So I think there's a range of new thinking emerging, and I think our challenge as a community is working out how we adapt those ideas to our various places.
I agree, and I think we need to we need to rethink the idea of taxation and debt.
We've actually got some other questions. Do we want to just move to that before we go on to the Melbourne? I see Bronwyn Morgan has her hand up. Sorry to interrupt, but
a good call, Michelle. Bronwyn, jump in.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I would, it's a sort of observation / question, which is, it's such a great model, but one of the challenges, I think I've seen it really animate either social or environmental imagination, but how you kind of connect those two. I don't know if you had any experience in the Melbourne. I wasn't able to come to the last one actually, but it's the actual intersection of the social boundaries and the ecological ceilings that's often where the really gnarly stuff happens. And somehow maybe people self-select into groups that are passionate about one or other of the things, but I don't see the model actually by itself giving us a lot of tools to get at that particular intersection. Although I think that question of how you factor in the planetary boundaries and the sort of limits to growth helps to some extent, but it's still, where do you, I don't know. I think there are both questions of trade-offs and questions of not seeing social and economic as distinct, that the model is not quite obvious to me how it helps.
It's a fantastic reflection, Bronwyn, and it's one that's been top of our mind, particularly in the last week or two, as we've been trying to distill and pull together what is kind of the first phase report. And in particularly, I think there's sort of two parts of it for me. One is there is a question of reconnection, which has come up really as a theme across all of the workshops. There's reconnecting to each other at a social foundation level, community and belonging kind of come up there. And then there's reconnecting to the natural environment and to country, which is around that idea that we are not separate from. And so there's a kind of, the nature of building a framework creates segments and some separation, despite the donut itself as a whole being one of the only models that I've seen that actually does create sort of integration of them. So it's a real duality, I think.
And before we move on, can I just jump in and plug the Green Prints model, which the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and myself and others have been working on, which emerged just before the donut. And it actually is an Australian way of looking at nested sustainability within an economic, social, Indigenous knowledge, scientific framework. And we're actually redrawing the donut as we speak. I've got a graphic designer redesigning it so that there's an inner circle around ecological connection and place-based. And the actually scales up from place, from Indigenous people's knowledge, wisdom and connection to other local people's connection into the donut, up to planetary boundaries and back down again to local bioregions. So that's the work that we're passionate about, because we see the donut economy framework as a useful abstract framework, but every country and every culture is going to have to understand its own way of, exactly as you say, Kai, the connections. So I just say there's an Aussie version coming out very soon. I'm just waiting for my graphic designer to do it so I can start blogging about it and people to really think that without a where is all this stuff happening? And we've started that with Regen Melbourne, and I know other places will do it, but without a really specific where, you're not actually engaging with ecological limits locally. And planetary boundaries actually have limitations as to their impact on local activities. If anyone's sat in on workshops that we've run with Will Steffen, we've got them on recording. Planetary boundaries only takes you so far in terms of environmental care and connection. So
yeah, no, that's spot on, Michelle.
I love that connection. That's really helpful.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Brian.
and I'd love links to that in the chat if there's anything you can share yet, Michelle. But I feel, we sort of the last step of our process this time has been to start that drafting of an augmented donut for Melbourne. Which sort of does land it in place. And one of those themes that has come up that we need to integrate visually is that reconnection piece. But I might use that as a bit of a segue to talk about the Melbourne work and just get your reflections on that as well. And as I do that, I just wanted to note there was a question from Jackie/Steve in the chat, which is around, would students encounter this model now in universities, and how do we get conventional economic thinking to start embracing some of these models? And I'm sort of haven't spent time in universities in Australia for quite a long time, but I have heard anecdotes that there are now some really wonderful economists teaching kind of first year economics and using these models. And Michelle, I'm sure you've come across that as well. There's more of that happening. Clearly it's not happening at the scale it needs to, but I think it's encouraging at least to hear some of those stories. So what I might do is share my screen again and just take you through the work that we did sort of in some more detail. And again, I'll stop and pause here and allow for both questions and reflections in the chat. And I guess what I wanted to show you first was from a process perspective, what we've done. So you've got to cast your minds back to 2020. And for those of you who are in Melbourne, you'll know how disruptive that year was in terms of the lockdown itself. So we hit the second lockdown at about the same time that we were hosting Kate Rayworth for a masterclass at the Small Giants Academy. And in that session, we had a lot of people put up their hands and saying, we've seen what's happened in Amsterdam, we've seen the methodology, we'd love to do that in Melbourne, or we'd love to do that in Sydney. And so a few groups were formed, how do we run a similar process in our city? And in Melbourne, we were lucky enough to have a number of people who were already engaged in these conversations internationally. So we had Sean at Circular Economy Victoria, who'd had conversations with the C40 network, with the Doughnut Economics Action Lab. We had Alison at the City of Melbourne, who was really interested in engaging the city in this process. And we had Stephen at the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, who kind of brought that whole world to this work and that very unique vantage point of having a kind of an overview of Melbourne's, particularly Melbourne's social sector. And so we got together and we said, well, how do we do this? Then the second lockdown got more entrenched, more deeper. It caused a huge economic disruption, and that also ran straight into the municipal elections in Victoria, which meant that the idea of doing a kind of top-down approach to this process evaporated, which is what happened in Amsterdam. They did quite a top-down kind of mayor saying this is what we should do, and the system falling into a place around that. That wasn't an option for us. And so instead we flipped the model, to some extent, the methodology on its head, and said, well, why don't we do a kind of community approach first, work out a kind of localization of the model to Melbourne, and then we can take that to various institutions, to various levels of government, and talk about how it could potentially be manifested in a real way. And so what you see in front of you is the community engagement project that we put together. We ran 5 workshops through February, modeled on the Doughnut methodology. So the words healthy and connected and enabled, they come out of the methodology itself and have a number of dimensions that sit underneath it. We also conducted a series of interviews with prominent Melburnians about their lockdown experience, about what they think the lessons were for our city, how they think the economic machine should restart. We've done a series of preliminary insights, and what you find now is that we're right in the middle of this, or actually towards the end of this roundtables phase, where we're doing what we're doing today. We're bringing the insights we've generated, we're getting reflections and questions and challenges from all sorts of wonderful people. And we're using the next week to distill all of that into the final report, which will be launched by Kate as part of a speech at Melbourne Knowledge Week, which is on the 28th of April. The report will be made public, and we'll then be able to talk about the road ahead, the roadmap ahead. So that's the process we've been on. I just wanted you to locate you all in this phase that we're in right now. And what we've actually, so this is the network that's formed around the work. These are the organizations that have wanted to put their name behind the work, including NENA, of course, but there's lots of others. And there are lots of other people involved in the network. I think we're up to about 500 people. We've got about 35, 36 organizations who are represented. And we also have a Slack group, which you can jump on. Sean will put the link in the chat, which has 250 people who are actively participating in conversations around the future of our city. So what we've actually done is many of you will have seen the methodology on the left there. That's the methodology that came out of the pilot cities of Amsterdam, Portland, and Philadelphia. And this methodology is quite comprehensive. I think it's a 40-page document. It's public. Again, we'll put it in the chat. And that talks about how do you localize the macro Doughnut model to a city scale. The core part of that methodology is looking at the social foundation in a more granular way. So as we spoke about earlier, there are limitations to the Sustainable Development Goals once you get to city scale. For example, the SDGs have an explicit goal around gender equality. Now that's absolutely relevant on a city scale, but there are other elements to equality that need to be called out and surfaced when it comes to the city scale that aren't in the macro models. There are a number of things that need to be brought to light. And the way they do that is they thematically, they've created these themes at the social level of healthy cities, connected cities, empowered cities, and enabled cities. And each one of these has 4 dimensions that you can see in front of you. Now we are a little bit down the rabbit warren now, like it starts to get a little bit granular, but just go with me and hopefully it lands for you at some point. So we ran workshops around these themes, and we asked people, what is your experience of Melbourne through these lenses? What works? What are the examples that are moving Melbourne in a positive direction within these themes? What are the challenges? So we did a whole bunch of exploration using interactive Miro boards online, all on Zoom. And then we distilled all of that. And the image on the right is a wonderful image that actually Kieran is right here. So you should wave at the camera now, Kieran. Take credit for the image on the right. That image is basically representing that we do have a localization element here. So we're moving towards what does a local Doughnut look like for Melbourne? And I'll come back to that in a minute. So what I would love to do is walk through these 4 workshops that we ran just on the social foundation today. We won't have time to do the ecological layer in this session. But what I want to do is ask you, before I present to you some of the insights around each theme, I wanted to ask you all a question around when you experience your city to be healthy. So open up the chat box. This is a little bit of an experiment, but open up the chat box on your screen if you can. And I'd love just to hear kind of a stream of consciousness from you around when do you experience your city to be healthy? What are you doing? What are you experiencing? Are you walking along a creek? Are you in a park with friends? Are you in a really engaging workplace? What are you experiencing when you live in a healthy city? I appreciate not everyone's in Melbourne, but just think about the city environment that you're in. And as you can see here from this illustration, which comes out of the workshop we ran, that the themes or the dimensions that sit within this theme are health, housing, food, and water. And of course, that can feel a bit limiting, but use it as a little bit of an entry point, I guess, into your brainstorming conversation. So Jackson, on a bike path, I love that mobility question, being in nature. Michelle, trees, parks, wildlife corridors, it's a big one. Farmers markets, Rhiannon, that's been a common one as well that we've heard. It's a really brilliant one. You get both the community aspect and being outside and being connected to our food system. Public transport, outdoors without crowds. It's a really interesting one. So there's a few ideas coming through. They keep them coming. I think that idea of connectedness in our local neighbourhood is a big one. Neighbours looking after each other. Along the ocean, nature, healthy people, sharing a connection, breathing freely, clean air, nature walks, low pollution. Wonderful themes coming through. Keep them coming. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where we landed in this process, but keep them coming. It's really, really, really good for us to have those insights just coming through as a stream of consciousness. What I want to share with you is what we found through this process, a healthy Melbourne is dependent upon. So just take note that this is from hundreds of contributions across a number of workshops, but these themes keep coming up. And these tell us that a healthy Melbourne is dependent ultimately on a meaningful connection to nature, that we feel connected as part of the natural environment. But it's also related to access to fresh, healthy, and local food. Those words are really important. They come up time and time again. There's one around healthy Melbourne being dependent on the integration of physical exercise into our mobility and transport. So not just that we can go running around nice natural environments, but that we can get to places and be part of our daily ritual to do physical exercise. Safety came up in a number of ways. In this context, physical safety, a healthy Melbourne is dependent on that. There was also a recognition, speaking of that embedded economy model that Sean was talking about, that we require an active reinvestment of public healthcare in our public healthcare. We can't have a healthy city without that. A very Melbourne response that I found and really hasn't come up in other cities as far as I can tell, is that the health of our city is dependent on the depth and richness of our art and culture. Our art and culture is kind of a proxy for the health of and vibrancy of our city, which I thought was a really interesting insight. And then finally, of course, our health as a city is dependent on the health of our ecosystem, clean air, clean water, and healthy soils. So that's a snapshot from, a 3-hour deep dive workshop around what our city is dependent on. There are lots of themes in there which I think do speak to the stream of consciousness coming through the chat. I'd love to open up just for two minutes if people have any reflections on that. Is there anything that's surprising? Is there anything that's super interesting or challenging? Does anyone want to jump in?
Oh, I just want to say I love the inclusion of art and culture, and I more and more feel like when there's no space mentally, physically, or resource-wise for that is maybe a canary in the coal mine indicator about, how much we're pushing the edges of extraction.
I think that's a really interesting framing on that. And I've been reflecting a lot on how much particularly, my social circle missed accessing art and culture last year during lockdown. So a lot of this is very much fed by that. We suddenly lost a lot. And that was one of the things that was so critical to our well-being.
And actually, the other thing I want to say is, this is sort of comes out of your third point about the integration of physical exercise into mobility and transport. The way that you sort of were explaining that there was a very specific feeling of, if I haven't turned my camera on, no, I have. It's not just, we want a gym, for example, even an outside gym. It's about, so there's something about, I want to call it livelihood. People want all the things you've listed, but they don't want them as specialized services sort of delivered in bubbles of their life. It's something about access to your list in a way that naturally, organically interlinks in everyday life, so that you get that exercise just because the way the public transport system is built. You can, walk 30 minutes along a green corridor and then hop on a tram for the last bit, but you don't get that unless you get people from different disciplines and backgrounds talking to each other and working together all the time. Like, there's something really challenging to the sectoral silos that we typically use in this, that's not really present in the list, but it's present in the spirit of how you talked about the list.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that. I think that's right. And Phoebe, you've mentioned Andreas Weber's conception of enlivenment, and we spoke about aliveness as a principle here, which I think speaks to that and the integration aspect of what you're mentioning as well.
I just had a question. Oh, sorry.
No, go, Emma, jump in.
Thanks. Sort of, how did you compile this list? Did you sort of go out to different groups in the community, or did you do like an online survey? Like, who's contributed to the list?
Yeah, fantastic question. I mean, we did a public call out through all of our networks. So if you think about those 5 organisations that I mentioned, we all have significant communities. But we also did this exercise as part of the Sustainable Living Festival. And so it was integrated into their programming, which had another audience. And then also, I guess I'd say that this is undoubtedly an early adopter audience. So this is not an extensive representative survey of Melbourne. That's not what the point of this exercise was. It was more around how do we take some of that early adoption energy. What Kate often speaks about is follow the energy. So follow that energy to start the localisation process, but also make sure that maintains an open invitation for other people to join. Yeah. And then in this roundtable exercise that we've been going through, we've targeted a few different communities that we really want to receive feedback on. But I would say there are huge gaps here. We're not claiming to be a representative sample by any means.
Yeah, no worries. I was just interested how you went about getting the, There
are about 100 people in each workshop.
Fantastic.
Each one of these workshops that we ran.
Can I break in?
Yes, please jump in.
Bob Douglas. I'm from the Council for the Human Future, based in Canberra, headed by John Hewson. I think what's missing here from this list is the statement, an expectation of human survival. I think what our council is particularly concerned about is that no government anywhere in the world is taking the 10 threats to future human survival with the kind of seriousness that's necessary. And we are trying to encourage governments around Australia to show the way on this. And it seems to me that if we can't, and many people are saying, and people like Will Steffen and others are saying that if we don't get these existential threats right, if we don't do that in the next 10 years, then our kids won't have survival as an expectation. So I would encourage you to put survival, expectation of human survival as a key element to being a healthy community.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for that contribution. That's brilliant. And I'm going to do some reading and follow up with you. That's a fantastic contribution. I've also noticed that, Simon, you've mentioned in the chat here that there is no explicit mention of a reinvigorated political or democratic culture, which I think is also really interesting in the context of health. We will come to that in the other workshops, and there's been an interesting discussion around, how useful are these segments in this conversation. Obviously, some framework is useful, but there are cross-cutting themes that sit across a number of these different workshops that we've been running. I'm going to move on to the next workshop, and obviously the commentary continues, right? There are cross-linking themes. The next workshop we held was on the idea of a connected Melbourne. So again, this is a beautiful visualization that Kieran did live scribing the session. And as you can see there, we have 4 segments here. We have both, I guess, technical elements, so questions of connectivity around information flows, around internet access. We have questions of mobility, which really speak to moving around our city in ways that are equitable and fair. And then we have questions of community and culture, which are quite different in tone. And this is the one workshop that I feel like is a little bit jarring in the way that it tries to put these 4 themes together, but that's the way that the methodology so far has been developed. So again, I'd love to ask you that question. If you've warmed up your fingers now, in the chat function, what is your experience of living in a connected city or a connected place? What are you feeling when you're experiencing that? You know, that people have spoken about that idea of, you know, the dawn service in their street, where everyone in their neighborhood walks out to the front lawn and experiences that moment together. Or people have spoken about the ability to get from one side of the city to another using public transport really easily. Or that idea of experiencing our large cultural institutions or connections to First Nations and First Nations culture and language. So just if there are thoughts that come up for you around when do you feel like you're living in a connected city, I'd love to hear them. Sense of responsibility, that's an interesting one. We feel that together as a community. Any other thoughts on living in a connected place? Or what living in a connected place is dependent upon? Yeah, feeling a sense that our neighbours can look out for us or support us. We definitely felt that in Melbourne, I think, when our radius became 5 kilometres and suddenly our street was everything. That sense of neighbourhood connection was so important. There's a point there around communication and communicating well. We can easily gather as local communities, street parties, music, dinner parties. That's a big one, I think, and feeling that connection. Connection with our shop owners, our local shops, which was a big one again here when our city shrunk in size. A sense of friendliness and kindness. Hugh McKay talks beautifully about that and the importance of some of those fundamentals of feeling like you live in a healthy culture. Communication, Susan, connection on, you know, connected city rests on communication. We also spoke a little bit about multilingual communication in Melbourne, given the significant multicultural diversity here. Sense of belonging. Interesting questions, Phoebe, around city size, aged care, childcare. Okay, now we're getting warmed up. This is good. So you keep them coming, and I'm going to speak to a little bit to some of the insights that we had from the workshop and from some of our interviews. But these are the sort of requirements or dependencies that we found for creating a connected city. And they are, first and foremost, the easy and equitable access to information flow. So Susan, I think it speaks to your communications question, which is both kind of, technical and infrastructure based. It's things like, good internet connection that's universally accessible, but it's also good libraries in communities and having community communication going on at a local scale. And as I mentioned, that multilingual aspect is incredibly important there as well. There was this sense of belonging that underpinned almost all of the conversations here around connection and community, which needs to be called out. There was a continuous conversation around the embrace of First Peoples culture and language in Melbourne, and really that's sort of the localised version of that. So not the kind of macro we need to reconnect, but really what is the history, culture and language in Melbourne. Again, arts, culture and festival sector is a big one there for Melbourne. And particularly, I think the kind of rhythmic nature of the festivals in Melbourne, the fact that we can almost map out our calendar based on the festivals that we experience here. And similarly, the undeniable role of our sporting culture in Melbourne, both that experience that people describe of walking along Birrarung Ma towards the MCG on a Friday after work, but also that experience of going to community sport on the weekends with our kids and having that sense of community and connection that sits around our sporting culture. There was some of the round tables, we've had this conversation around thriving public spaces, libraries, community centres, parks being such an integral aspect of having a sense of connection in our communities. And similarly, out of one of our round tables, there was an in-depth conversation around religious and spiritual diversity and making sure that our city celebrates and nurtures that sense of religious and spiritual diversity. And then, as an economic historian, I'm so proud that there was a conversation around our pre and post-colonial history and the fact that we have disconnected from that in so many ways through our formal and informal education systems. And there's a need to bring that back if we want to feel a sense of connection as a city. So there are just some of the kind of distilled versions. Again, think about this as the output of many, many dozens of contributions around people's experiences here. And I'd also just like to note, these workshops were not just about this kind of when do we experience connection. We also spoke about the challenges to that. We spoke about the practical examples. We spoke about the metrics of how you might measure something like this. The workshops themselves are much deeper. I'm kind of giving you the surface level insights here to, I guess, invite you to go down the rabbit hole with us. Does anyone have any reflections on those ones?
I've just been typing a number of comments, Kai, as the earth-centered girl. The fact that connection doesn't say connection to the soils, the plants, the animals that visit the yard, the birds, the trees. To me, it's a huge gap, but I won't harp on because everyone knows I'm constantly banging on about the earth. But, you know, we live and breathe because all of these other species live and breathe. And even if it's a city, it has to be acknowledging that connection to place and the connection, the very real connection every day. Most people get joy from anything they see, whether it's a kookaburra or a scrappy old possum. So I think that connection, there's so much work that needs to be done in our non-Indigenous cultures that we don't even see the fact that we don't even see the things we should be seeing. So it's...
Yeah, no, it's a great point, Michelle. And you can keep harping on about that again and again. I really enjoy it. And I think it's a really important reminder. I also feel like the drawbacks of a model like this is its segmentation, right? So people in the workshop knew that there was going to be a workshop on ecologically healthy Melbourne and may have parked some of those reflections that they might have had. And so I think our job here in the synthesis process is to try and bring that together in a more considered way. So I really appreciate that. Any other reflections before I talk you through the next one? All right.
Yeah, it's a quick one, sorry. One that comes up, I guess, in a more meta, the way who was talking earlier about, again, there's no conversation about actually engaged democracy and community level democratic participation. We're talking about thriving public spaces, libraries, community centres and parks. And something that consistently comes up, again, segmented to Michelle's broader context, is that that devolved the loss of our citizenship at all tiers of government, that we're now customers, and that's an economic participatory engagement rather than as citizens, including global or earth citizens in the communities that we inhabit. Just wanted to throw that in.
Can I make a comment as well?
Yeah, Simon, please.
And just following up from what Phoebe said, because I think that's right. I mean, all this is beautiful. What I'm conscious of is that we are coming out of 3 or 4 decades of neoliberal thinking that has constructed our sense of self around individual gain and what we get out of it. A lot of the stuff is I love all the stuff, but a lot of it's quite like it's connected, but it's also very, very much around the I or the individual. And I think we actually have to, for a safer future and a connected future, we have to reinvent the idea of the political self that is communal and not individual and is connected. And that means reinventing the notion of the self for the future. So that's all I want to say.
No, thank you so much for that. And I guess a couple of thoughts that come to mind. One is that, you know, one of the ways that Kate speaks about, I guess, reinventing economics is explicitly speaking to that dynamic of from the individual rational economic actor, and as Sean said, the economic man, from that to a much more integrated, interconnected description of a socially adaptable human and community around that. So I think she makes that point really clearly. And I think it's an interesting reflection on the kind of the outputs of this versus the intention of the work. I'm going to reflect on that one. And the other point I'd make is really around that question of citizenship, which I love. And we reflected on it as a group of facilitators around how strong the sense of citizenship was in these conversations around the future of Melbourne, which I think comes from both kind of, I guess the drivers of involvement here were, one, people are excited about the donut, and two, I think people felt like they'd earned the right to be in a conversation about our future based on our experiences that we shared last year in lockdown. I think there was an intrinsic relationship there. And so that idea of civic participation, of citizenship, was a really strong sense coming through the work. And we'll get to the empowerment workshop in a minute, where we speak explicitly about those themes as well. But thank you for those contributions. The third workshop we had was on an enabled Melbourne. And this one, as you can see in front of you, was framed around 4 themes. Income, jobs were big ones here, and I guess economic security, economic safety, as well as education and access to energy. And this was a really interesting workshop because there was a lot of conversations here around the nature of paid and unpaid work, and the question of volunteering and volunteering culture being such a big part of, I think, the Melbourne experience and the experiences of many communities. So that was a big one. There was also questions around, informal and formal education. So there's being, not making sure that we're not kind of defaulting just to large institutional, I guess, old economy education models, but also thinking about community scale education. And then I guess really interesting conversation around income distribution, conversations around redistribution, valuing of various professions over others, even conversations around universal basic income and universal basic services as interesting ideas that have emerged in recent times. So we'll do a quicker version of the brainstorming exercise on this one, but I'm just curious if there's anything that's coming up. I don't want to stop you from sharing. You've really started to warm up in the chat. So any sentences or ideas that come up to you around when you experience an enabled place, an enabled city, I'd love to read them in the chat, and then I'll show you where the top line research landed from our workshops. And I'll move through this one a little bit faster to make sure we've got enough time at the end to talk about the vision and then also the augmentation of the donut for Melbourne. But if anyone has any thoughts, please jot them down. When do we experience our city as an enabled place? Jackson's introducing big red wine topics again. Federal jobs guarantee, a much more compatible income solution than a UBI. I really want to have that conversation. Cultural events, helping with connection and inclusion. I think that's true. The interrelationship between, culture, connection with jobs and income and enablement and education. These are cross-cutting themes that we have to acknowledge. Everyone can participate in decision making. Yep, so there's that participation aspect again. We don't feel like the planning is top down. We feel like we're encouraged to be involved. Very much around wealth distribution, redistribution. We've seen obviously in the period of COVID in Australia, but also around the world, that become even more skewed. Intentional communities, Auroville. What a great reflection. I was there more than a decade ago now. I wonder how it's developed since then. All right, I'm going to show you similarly where this work landed around enablement. So the first one here is around the relationship between community and education. So an enabled place requires this strong connection between community and education. This is just recognizing that, like, having large, prestigious institutions, education institutions, doesn't lead to an enabled place. If they're elitist, if they're separated from the community that they probably originally intended to serve. There's a question around equitable access to meaningful work, meaning different things to different people, but acknowledging that benefits both an individual at an individual level, but also, as was raised just before, at a collective level, at a social society-wide level, that has huge benefits. Melbourne's one of the most expensive cities in the world, so there's huge conversations around equitable access to renewable energy on the one hand, but also affordable housing and controlling costs of living. Again, bringing back that state investment, so public investment in education being a really critical part of this, the role of the state. And as I mentioned before, that rich volunteering culture actually underpins the ability to feel like you're living in an enabled place. And just as a contribution from a recent roundtable, there was a sense that we can't have this sense of enablement unless we also have strong political leadership, which encompasses longer term thinking. Now we can talk about, we can go into the details of what we think good political leadership looks like. But the point to make here was really around the short-termism fundamentally undermines the idea of living in an enabled city. So there's some of the reflections that came up for us. And as I said before, this is multi-layered, and when the report comes out, you'll see how it all fits together. But it's to give you a bit of a snapshot of where that landed. Couple of minutes for reflections on this before I run you through the last social workshop that we had, and then I'll try and bring it all together for you. Any reflections on this one? I see in the chat, Tirania was speaking about small organisations are valued. It's not just large ones. I think that's really valuable. Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, Tirania here.
Oh, hey.
Hey. Yeah, I was also thinking about the whole issue of ownership. Yeah, definitely small organisations. Definitely, there's, even in the not-for-profit sector, there's just such an agenda for mergers and for growth. Pro Bono recently held an event that was about mergers, and that's just been the trajectory, which is following the corporate sector.
Yeah,
so something that ways to kind of, I don't know whether it's reverse, but alternative to that. But also ownership. A lot of us in the new economy space have been talking about ownership, shared community ownership, shared ownership, community wealth building, the local community owning, access to resources is absolutely critical, as well as we're not going to access them in this time of increasing privatisation without looking at the issue of ownership.
Yeah, it's a great one. And when Kate speaks about how you sort of adopt this thinking to an organisation, she speaks about, I think it's 5 levels of integration, or some way of phrasing that, I can't remember. But one of the top level is having a purpose that's aligned with, the donut, which is sort of the easiest thing to do. But then once you get down that scale, you get to ownership, which I think is the sort of the second most fundamental. And then there's also financing, which is sort of where does the money come from to enable the ownership that enables this to be done in a holistic way. So I think it's a great point, and I think there is Sean might be able to bring a link up for you in the chat that speaks explicitly to that framework.
Yeah, actually, I've seen her speak about that.
Great.
She spoke at an event with Preston Council in the UK about that. So she's, as you said, she's constantly adapting. So she's adopted that as far as I can tell.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna step through the next one. Apologies for moving a little bit faster, but I don't want to run out of time. So the last workshop that we held on the social foundation for Melbourne, and again, credit where credit's due to Kieran for somehow visualising this workshop, which was significant and deep, and at times really deeply passionate as well. But this question speaks about what it means to live in an empowered city. There are themes like peace and justice. Is our justice system fit for purpose for a 21st century city? Equality and diversity, which I think is such a fundamental question, particularly in a city that's always communicates how proud we are of living in a multicultural city, but how real is that on the ground, and how do people experience that? The question that a number of people have raised here around political voice, and how much do we nurture that idea of political participation and citizenship in our city, and then social equity, which I think speaks to some of the other themes that have been raised here around access to education, access to opportunities, and equity on all fronts. And I'm just noticing, if you really squint hard, you can see some of the reflections there. But in the social equity ones, there's notes around eradicating neoliberalism, an economy that's distributed by design, speaks to some of the themes that we've spoken about already in this session. But I would love, let's just do 60 seconds this time. Reflections from you all around, when do you feel like you're in an empowered place, an empowered city? What are you doing? What are you experiencing? Who are you with? What are the feelings that come up for you? For me, it would be being pulled out of my primary school by my parents and taken to a rally to save Albert Park from the Formula One Grand Prix when I was probably no more than 8 or 9. But that sense of participation in a community around a particularly local issue that we felt deeply impacted by and not heard by, but the sort of experience of that, of walking together, was a really formative one for me and spoke to this theme, I think, quite a lot. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. That sense of opportunity that comes up when there's a city or a community vision that aligns with values. So seeing that, I think, is really important. And we'll talk about the vision that we've come to as a community in a moment. A sense of opportunity, an understanding that there is we're looking for freedom, but that comes with, significant responsibilities that we have to hold as a community. Really interesting reflections. Keep them coming through. I'm going to let you tap away. And I guess where we landed as a community after this workshop, and as I said, these are every one of these sentences holds so much detail, and we really need lots more time to work through this together, and that's the plan after we publish the report. One of the most fundamental aspects of this, I think, was an openness and a culture to continuous learning, but also unlearning. So making sure that both of those aspects are in the culture of our city, that we appreciate there are layers that we need to strip back in order to, continue becoming a more and more empowered place. The embrace and active encouragement of political participation was such a big theme, and I was so glad that someone raised that a few minutes ago around that being an important part of the health of any city, the vibrancy of any city, and in this case, the empowerment that people feel living in a city, that it's not seen as something that's discouraged, that it's encouraged, that it's nurtured, that the culture really sits around that. And then I guess the next one is the embrace of diversity and inclusion as a strength of the city. And again, I think this is something that is stated quite often, but isn't necessarily felt by everybody. And this is something obviously we need to work on. And similarly around social equity as a pillar of progress, something that people say, and councils will say that, and cities will say that, and politicians will say this, but there's something about that sitting in the way that we experience a city that it's important. And then the last one is a little bit like the first one, that this idea of an openness to collaboration, and Tarania, maybe to your point earlier around that it's not about competition and scale and growth, that we have a culture in our city that really speaks to the potency of collaboration as a really important part of that. So that's where we distilled the top line insights from this workshop. I'd love to hear if anyone has any immediate reflections on those, or any glaring omissions that you can see from your vantage point, and then I'll start to wrap things up. And note that these are really significant themes, and it's probably a good time to say that the work that we've put together here, that will come out in a week or so, is sort of the first piece of work out of the Regen Melbourne network, but that will involve a series of signposts that we're going to be putting out that encourages people to access this work from lots of different perspectives. Both, how do you make this real in your neighbourhood, but also at a kind of thematic level, what expertise can we bring around these dimensions to give them some real, metrics and things that we can tangibly hold on to. Just looking a little bit at the chat here.
Douglas.
Yeah, Bob, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to say what I think is missing from that list is a process for people to become engaged.
Okay.
There isn't enough of that. Kitchen table conversations have empowered the electorate of Indi because the process was there for people to get engaged. I think the Indi electorate has shown us something of that process, but I think that's seriously missing from that list.
Yeah, I love that, Bob. Thank you.
I was just going to say, I think this is almost a list that you need to start with. This really underpins, like as it says, it underpins everything. And it's sort of the place where you need to begin in a way to then engage on those other elements.
Yeah, interesting. I love that idea. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just show you the image that Kieran did of the Ecologically Healthy workshop that we ran. This is the outer ring of the donut, as you can remember. And this speaks to those three dimensions of air, land, and water. And we're not going to delve into this simply because we don't have time, but similar level of insights was generated here alongside, as we said, localized potential local metrics for measuring some of these things. And our goal here is to create I guess, small working groups around some of these themes to delve more deeply and combine the kind of community engagement sort of ground up approach that we've taken with the right level of expertise that sits across some of these domains, which of course people have been working on for decades and decades, and we want to bring that in as well in the next phase. But what I wanted to, I guess, end this conversation with was, in each one of these workshops, we held a component of them which was around visioning. So both, what is your vision for the city at a high level? And then what is your vision for each of the dimensions that we spoke about? You remember there was, 16 of them. What is your vision for the city in each one of those dimensions? So what is your vision for food in Melbourne? What is your vision for housing in Melbourne? So we collected dozens and dozens and dozens of these vision statements. And then our team went through a distillation exercise where we grouped those dozens and dozens of themes in a number of groups. And then we elevated some of the dominant words that were used by people in those exercises to create a summary statement for each one of these areas that were the groupings that were created.
Somebody just asked if Kai is offline. Is he still here?
I'm not sure. Might have lost him.
Yeah.
I think he's lost.
I thought he was giving everyone a moment to,
I did too.
contemplate
And
the
someone
depth
asked,
of the
"Where did you
vision.
go?"
How it tends to do these things. Well, I think then, Michelle, from our side, it's been great to be with NENA, and obviously, we respect NENA's leadership in this space, and I guess the Regen Melbourne movement is really just to bring people together around this highly communicatable theme called the Doughnut. And we look forward to getting any feedback from the report that will be published on the 28th of April. And Kate Rayworth is speaking, as Kai mentioned, at Melbourne Knowledge Week on the 28th as well. So look forward to maybe seeing you there. And any thoughts that you have, please reach out to us at rm@smallgiants.com.au.
Thank you so much, and do give our regards to Kai. We're sorry that we lost him at the last moment, but everyone very much appreciates all the work that you guys and all of your teams have done to bring these initial steps together. From the New Economy Network Australia's point of view, we're excited to see people really starting to come together to focus on economic issues, and what that means is all of society and challenging some of those framings. And I guess the only other thing I'd like to add is, for those of you who are joining this call who aren't familiar with the New Economy Network and our work, do visit the website. I've popped it in there. It's just www.neweconomy.org.au. We're connected to the We All International, the We All Wellbeing Economy International Alliance, a growing number of national hubs. And at the moment, some of our offerings include a really excellent short course on building a wellbeing economy for Australia, Introduction to Learning and Practice. So if you visit our website, you'll see that that short course starts on the 28th of April. We've had a number of terrific folks come through last year, and look forward to having further discussions this year. And if you have any other questions about some of the projects and issues mentioned today, please do get in touch with the folks involved, or if you're confused and can't find them, always feel free to send an email to nina@neweconomy.org.au. I'll just type it in, and we'll point you to the folks who are doing that work. And if you're interested in Green Prints, which is the initiative of my other organisation, AILA, we'll be sharing some updates about some of the stuff we're doing in the next 2 weeks across a whole range of social media and Facebook pages, as well as our website. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We're getting a lot of lovely thank yous through there. And to Sean and Kai, thank you so much for your time. And also Stephen Torsey. We look forward to seeing the report come out and perhaps seeing more community engaging with these holistic conversations.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm sorry I dropped out there.
we all thought we were contemplating important issues, and then somebody pointed out you weren't actually there anymore.
I'm sure the team picked it up. I really apologise for that. Someone was doing work in our street.
No, we understand. And we were just saying thank you so much to you guys for sharing all these insights and the work you've been doing. And we look forward to further updates. And I think there's going to be a lot of other communities around the place looking at Doughnut Economics more seriously and connecting with some of the Aussie versions some of us are working on, as well as other great initiatives. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And maybe I'll just say there are, as you say, there are lots of other work going on around Melbourne, and we are, connected with them as well. So if people want us to connect you to any group around Melbourne that we know, around Australia we know about, then we'd love to do that for you. So reach out, please, and jump on the Slack group if you want to hang out. We'd love your contributions, and I really appreciated the insights from today. They were super potent and valuable.
Thank you, everyone. And shockingly, we're going to wrap up 5 minutes before we were scheduled to, so that's nice. I think it's been a long session and it is a Friday. So thank you, everybody. Stay in touch, keep up all your awesome work, and I hope wherever you are, you can have a nice weekend. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.